Hello everyone. In today's class, we discuss about types of friction. Okay, there are four types of frictional force or friction. They are static friction, kinetic friction, limiting friction, and rolling friction. Let's discuss one by one. First one is static friction. Okay. So, what is static friction? Static means what? Rest. Static means rest. Static friction means the friction of force which exists when the body is at rest. Okay. For example, here the duster is placed on the table like this. Okay. Suppose I applied the external force to this duster. The duster does not move because here there is another force which is acting on the duster, which is acting opposite to the direction of applied force. That force is called as frictional force. This friction force is equal and opposite to the applied force up to certain limit. Okay, suppose I applied 2 Newton force for this, so the frictional force is also 2 Newton. If I applied 3 Newton, the frictional force is also 3 Newton. So two forces are equal in magnitude but they are opposite in direction. So the body is in equilibrium, so the duster is at rest. That means if we apply external force to certain limit, the frictional force also increases. By increase the applied force, frictional force also increases. For example, let us consider another example. So here the table is placed on surface, floor. Okay. Suppose I apply external force like this, the table does not move because there is another force which is acting opposite to the direction of applied force. That is called as frictional force. That here the frictional forces exist, but the object is at rest. The object does not move. That is called as static friction. Here the object tries to move, but it does not move. Okay, so that is called as static friction. What is the static friction? The frictional force which exists at rest, or it is the frictional force. It is the frictional force. Which comes into play when one body tends to move over the surface of another body, This is the frictional force which comes into play when one body moves over the surface. When one body tends to move, it tends to move over the surface of another body. Okay, that is to apply frictional force like this. The table does not move. Table force apply ಮಾಡ್ತಿರೋ table ಏನಾಗ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, ಮೂವ್ ಆಗ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. ಯಾಕೆ ಮೂವ್ ಆಗ್ತಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ನಾನು ಎಷ್ಟು ಅಪ್ಲೈಡ್ ಫೋರ್ಸ್ ಅಪ್ಲೈ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ನೋ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಅಮೌಂಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಫ್ರಿಕ್ಷನಲ್ ಫೋರ್ಸ್ ಕೂಡ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದೆ. ಸೊ ದಟ್ ಆಕ್ಟಿಂಗ್ ಇನ್ ಆಪೋಸಿಟ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್, ಸೊ ದ ಬಾಡಿ ಇಸ್ ರೆಸ್ಟ್. Okay, so that is called as static friction. It is the frictional force which comes into play when one body tends to move. Move ಆಗ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, move ಆಗ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. So it is called as static friction. Okay, so next type is limiting friction. So limiting, the name itself indicates that limit. What is that limit? The maximum value of static friction. Limiting friction is the maximum value of static friction for which the body just begins to move. This is important part. The body just begins to move. What is this limiting friction? It is the maximum value of static friction. It is the maximum value of static friction for which the body just begins to move. The body just begins to move over the surface of another body. Over the surface of another body. What is the limiting friction? It is the maximum. It has that limit. It has certain limit. That is the maximum value of static friction for which the body just begins to move. Okay. Initially, I applied the external force to move this table. Okay, that here the applied force is applied, but the object is at the table is at rest. That means it exerts static friction, because when I increase the applied force, friction force also increases. Therefore, there is an equilibrium, so the table is at rest. Okay. Suppose if I increase external force to certain extent like this, the body here the just begins. That means the table just begins. That means it is the maximum value of static friction. So after that maximum value, the body begins to move, because the frictional force increases with increase in the applied force up to certain limit. After that limit, frictional force goes on decreases with increase in the applied force. So first frictional force increase applied force increase ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದಂಗೆ friction force ಕೂಡ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ increase ಆಗ್ತಿರುತ್ತೆ. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ತನಕ static friction ಇದ್ದಾಗ, ಸೊ ಅಂದರೆ ಸರ್ಟನ್ ಲಿಮಿಟ್ ತನಕ ಆ ಲಿಮಿಟ್ನ ಕ್ರಾಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ಮೇಲೆ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, ಏನು ನಾವು ಅಪ್ಲೈಡ್ ಫೋರ್ಸ್ನ ಇನ್ಕ್ರೀಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ರೆ ಫ್ರಿಕ್ಷನಲ್ ಫೋರ್ಸ್ ಇನ್ಕ್ರೀಸ್ ಆಗೋದ್ ಬದಲು ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, ಡಿಕ್ರೀಸ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಇನ್ಕ್ರೀಸ್ ಆಗೋದ್ ಬದಲು ಡಿಕ್ರೀಸ್ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ ಅಂದರೆ ಯಾವ ಫೋರ್ಸ್ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಆಯ್ತು, ಅಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಟರ್ನಲ್ ಫೋರ್ಸ್ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಆಯಿತು. ಸೊ ಹಾಗಾದರೆ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಟರ್ನಲ್ ಫೋರ್ಸ್ ಯಾವ ಕಡೆಗೆ ಅಪ್ಲೈ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದೀವೋ ಅದೇ ಕಡೆಗೆ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, ಆಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟು ಮೂವ್ ಆಗೋಕ್ಕೆ ಶುರುವಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಜಸ್ಟ್ ಮೂವ್ ಆಗುತ್ತಲ್ಲ ಆಗ್ತಾನೆ, ಅದನ್ನ ನಾವೇನಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಿ, ಲಿಮಿಟಿಂಗ್ ಫ್ರಿಕ್ಷನ್. It is the frictional force which comes into play when one body just begins to move like this. Just begins to move over the surface of another body. It is known as limiting friction. Okay. Just static friction. Just move ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ, limiting friction. Okay. So static friction is denoted by Fs. Limiting friction is denoted by Fl. Okay. Next one is kinetic friction. So third friction is kinetic friction or kinetic frictional force. It is denoted by Fk. Fk is the kinetic friction. So kinetic means motion. Kinetic means movement or motion. So kinetic friction means the frictional force which exists when the body is in motion, or it is the frictional force which comes into play when one body moves over the surface of another body. When one body moves over the surface of another body, it is the frictional force. Frictional force which comes into play. Which comes into play when one body moves over the surface of another body. Moves over the surface of another body. And one body moves over the surface of another body is known as kinetic friction. It is the frictional force which comes into play when one body moves over the surface of another body. If the body is at rest, then it is static friction. If the body just begins, then it is limiting friction. If the body moves over the surface of another body, then it is known as kinetic friction. For example, here the duster is at rest. This is known as static friction. If the duster just begins to move under the application of external force, then it is known as limiting friction. If this duster starts moving like this, it is known as kinetic friction. Okay. What is kinetic friction? It is the frictional force which comes into play when one body moves over the surface of another body. It moves over the surface of another body like this. Okay. It is called as kinetic friction. And fourth one is rolling friction. Rolling friction. So this rolling friction is denoted by Fr. Fr is the rolling friction. that rolling. That means one body rolls instead of moving. We said that rolls over the surface of another body. One body rolls over the surface of another body. It is the frictional force. Frictional force which comes into play. When one body rolls over the surface of another body. When one body rolls over the surface of another body. On the surface of another body. Okay. What is rolling friction? It is the frictional force which comes into play when one body rolls over the surface of another body. Instead of moving, it rolls. For rolling, we consider wheels like that. Okay. So wheels are rolling. We said that wheels are rolling. Okay, they are not moving. We said that wheels are rolling. That is called as rolling friction. It is a frictional force which comes into play when one body rolls over the surface of another body. If the body tends to move over the surface of another body, that means the body is at rest. It is called static friction. The body just moves, then it is known as limiting friction. If the body starts moving, then it is known as kinetic friction. Instead of moving, it rolls, then it is known as rolling friction. For example, skating, wheelchairs are the examples. So skating, wheelchairs are the example for rolling friction. Okay. So here the table is at rest. So it is known as static friction. If you apply action of force, the table initially does not move, then it is known as static friction. Okay. Next, if increasing the external force, the frictional force also increases. Then frictional force also increases. After certain limit, the frictional force goes on decreases by increasing the external force. Then the body just move like this. This is known as limiting friction. Again, if I increasing the external force, the body starts moving like this. This is known as kinetic friction. If I fix the roller for this table, then the table moves easily. That means rolls easily. That is known as rolling friction. Okay. There are 4 types of friction. There are static friction, limiting friction, kinetic friction and rolling friction. What is static friction? It is a frictional force which comes into play when one body tends to move over the surface of another body. Then what is kinetic limiting friction? It is the maximum value of static friction for which the body just begins to move. Okay. Then what is kinetic friction? It is the frictional force which comes into play when one body moves over the surface of another body. Then what is rolling friction? It is the frictional force which comes into play when one body rolls over the surface of another body. Okay. Walking. So initially they are at rest. That means it is static friction. Okay. Next, this is the next foot na tege try ಮಾಡ್ತಿರಲ್ಲ ಇದೇನಿದು limiting friction. So foot ತೆಗೆದಿದ್ರೆ walk ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಅದು kinetic friction. ಇದೇ ರೀತಿ ಕಾಲ್ skating shoes ಹಾಕೊಂಡು ಓಡಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಏನದು rolling friction. Okay. So this is the best example. Okay. Rest ಅಲ್ಲಿರೋದು static friction. Just move ಆಗ್ತಿದೀವಲ್ಲ ಇದರ walk ಮಾಡೋದು ಏನದು kinetic limiting friction. ವಾಕ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದೀವಿ ಇದರ ಅನ್ನೋದು kinetic friction. There skating shoes ಹಾಕೊಂಡ್ರೇನು rolling friction. Okay. I think it is understandable. Next, we define coefficient of friction. So this coefficient of friction is denoted by the letter mu. Coefficient of friction is denoted by mu. So we know that friction is directly proportional to normal reaction. Frictional force or friction is directly proportional to the normal reaction. Normal reaction. Okay. What is friction? It is the component of the contact force which is acting parallel to the contact surface. What is normal reaction? It is the component of the contact force is acting perpendicular to the contact surface. It is denoted by N or R. N in the denote madbodu athwa R in the denote madbodu. So, the frictional force is the normal reaction. Here, friction is directly proportional to normal reaction. That means, as friction increases, the normal force also increases. Frictional force increases, normal force also increases. Or otherwise, as frictional force decreases, normal force also decreases. Frictional force increase ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ, normal reaction of normal force ಕೂಡ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, perpendicular force ಕೂಡ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, increase ಆಗ್ತಿರುತ್ತೆ. Frictional force decrease ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ, normal reaction ಕೂಡ ಏನಾಗ್ತಿರುತ್ತೆ, decrease ಆಗ್ತಿರುತ್ತೆ. That is, friction is directly proportional to normal reaction. Okay, friction is directly proportional to normal reaction. That is, F, friction is denoted by F. So F is directly proportional to R or N. F is directly proportional to, friction is directly proportional to normal reaction. So to remove this proportionality sign, we put a constant. That constant is known as coefficient of friction. Okay, so F is equal to, starting class proportionality sign remove ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂದ್ರೆ equals ತಗೊಂಡು ಒಂದು ಕಾನ್ಸ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ತಗೋಬೇಕು. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಆ ಕಾನ್ಸ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ನ ಏನಂತ ತಗೊಳ್ತಿದೀವಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ರೆ mu ಅಂತ ತಗೊಳ್ತೀವಿ. ಕಾನ್ಸ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಅಂತ ತಗೊಳ್ತಿದೀವಿ mu. So F is equal to mu, ಕಾನ್ಸ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ನ k ಅಂತ ನಾವು ತಗೋಬಹುದು, ಬೇರೆ ಲೆಟರ್ಸ್ ಇಂದ ನಾವು ಡಿನೋಟ್ ಮಾಡಬಹುದು. ಅದು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಕಾನ್ಸ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ನ mu ಅಂತ ತಗೊಳ್ತೀವಿ. So F is equal to mu into N, where F is the frictional force, mu is the coefficient of friction, and N is called normal reaction. It is called normal reaction. So here we want to define coefficient of friction, that is mu. So if F is equal to mu into N, then mu is equal to F by N. Mu is equal to F by N. So coefficient of friction is defined as ratio of frictional force to the normal reaction. Coefficient of friction is defined as the ratio of frictional force to the normal reaction. This coefficient of friction is unitless and dimensionless quantity, because here friction is also force. So the assignment of friction is Newton. Normal reaction is also force, its assignment is Newton. So Newton gets cancelled, so it is unitless. So friction has unit, but friction, coefficient of friction doesn't has any unit and dimension. What is coefficient of friction? It is the ratio of frictional force to the normal reaction. So similarly, there are four types of coefficient of friction. There are coefficient of static friction, coefficient of limiting friction, coefficient of kinetic friction, coefficient of rolling friction. In general, we define two important coefficient of frictions, that is static friction and limiting friction. Static friction, coefficient of static friction and coefficient of kinetic friction. Okay. First we define coefficient of static friction. Coefficient of static friction. Generally, friction is denoted by mu. So coefficient of static friction is denoted by mu s, coefficient of static friction. There are also friction, or that static friction is directly proportional to normal reaction. Static friction is directly proportional to normal reaction. So static friction is denoted by S, is directly proportional to normal reaction, that is N. Okay. Here also, to remove this proportionality sign, we put a constant, that is mu s, coefficient of static friction. So Fs is equal to mu s into N, where mu s is the constant. The constant is known as coefficient of static friction. Okay. So mu s is equal to Fs by N. Mu s is equal to Fs by N. That means coefficient of static friction is defined as ratio of static friction to the normal reaction. Is defined as the ratio of static friction to the normal reaction. Similarly, limiting friction. that is coefficient of limiting friction. It is denoted by mu. Limiting friction is denoted by Fl, but coefficient of limiting friction is denoted by mu L. Okay, so here also limiting friction is directly proportional to normal reaction. Limiting friction is directly proportional to normal reaction, that is Fl is directly proportional to N, or to remove this proportionality sign we put a constant, that is mu L into N. If Fl is equal to mu L into N, then mu L is equal to Fl by N. That is, the coefficient of limiting friction is defined as ratio of limiting friction to the normal reaction. Okay. Similarly, we define kinetic friction and rolling friction. Coefficient of kinetic friction that is denoted by mu k, because kinetic friction is denoted by Fk and coefficient of kinetic friction is denoted by mu. For that we get mu k is equal to Fk by N, because kinetic friction is directly proportional to normal reaction, that is Fk is directly proportional to N, or Fk is equal to mu k into N, and mu k is equal to Fk by N. So coefficient of kinetic friction is defined as ratio of kinetic friction to the normal reaction. And fourth one is coefficient of rolling friction. This coefficient of rolling friction is denoted by mu r. So here also rolling friction that is Fr is directly proportional to normal reaction N. So Fr is equal to mu r into N, or mu r is equal to Fr by N. That is, the coefficient of rolling friction is defined as ratio of rolling friction to the normal reaction. So these are the types of coefficient of friction. So generally, coefficient of friction is the ratio of friction to the normal reaction. Coefficient of static friction is the ratio of static friction to the normal reaction. Coefficient of kinetic friction is the ratio of kinetic friction to the normal reaction. Coefficient of limiting friction is the ratio of limiting friction to the normal reaction. And then finally, coefficient of rolling friction is the ratio of rolling friction to the normal reaction. So note this, coefficient of friction doesn't has any unit and dimension formula. Okay.